The satellite feed flickered twice before going dark. Somewhere in the Pentagon's basement operations center, a colonel leaned forward and whispered a single word into his headset. The word traveled through fiber optic cables buried beneath Virginia clay, bounced off 3 classified relay stations, and arrived in the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II screaming through Kurdish airspace at 400 knots. The pilot didn't respond immediately. She was busy watching her heads-up display paint 17 hostile contacts in thermal orange across a canyon that shouldn't have existed on any map. The terrain below looked like God had taken a cleaver to the earth, sheer granite walls plunging 800 feet, a river threading through shadows so deep the FLIR couldn't penetrate them, and somewhere in that impossible darkness, 300 Allied soldiers with maybe 20 minutes of ammunition left. The generals had already written the after-action report in their heads. They'd used phrases like acceptable losses and tactical withdrawal. They hadn't counted on Major Vesper Kine refusing to turn her aircraft around. She'd earned her call sign 6 years ago during a training exercise gone wrong, when she'd kept a crippled F-16 airborne long enough to glide it into a dry lake bed instead of ejecting over a Nevada town. They'd called her Vesper after the evening star, the last light you see before darkness takes over, the one that guides you home when everything else has failed. The name stuck because it fit, not because she was flashy or reckless, but because she showed up when everyone else had already left the sky. She had a way of appearing in impossible situations with her airframe battered and her fuel gauge screaming, yet somehow still carrying enough ordnance to change the outcome. The men in her squadron had laughed at first, made jokes about her height, her gender, the fact that she flew the A-10 instead of something sleek and fast. They stopped laughing after Kandahar, after she'd carved a gunship path through Taliban positions so precise that ground forces thought they were watching footage, not reality. Now she keyed her radio with 2 fingers, her other hand steady on the stick. Actual, this is Vesper 2-1. I have eyes on the canyon. Confirm I am cleared hot for danger close. The voice that came back was tight with something between hope and resignation. Vesper 2-1, negative. Stand by for extraction coordinates. The position is compromised. We're pulling everyone back. She didn't respond. Instead, she rolled her aircraft 30 degrees and dove toward the canyon rim, her engines screaming like twin demons as the altimeter unwound. Below her, the world was fire and smoke, and the small, desperate shapes of men who'd been told help wasn't coming. The A-10 Thunderbolt II is not a beautiful aircraft. It's a brutalist's fever dream, designed around a 30mm rotary cannon so powerful they built the plane around the gun instead of the other way around. Vesper's particular airframe was older than she was, with panel patches across the fuselage where shrapnel had punched through during missions over Syria and Iraq. The ground crews had stopped repainting the kill markings on her nose gear. There were too many, and besides, everyone knew what she'd done. Now the paint was worn to bare metal in places, giving the aircraft a scarred, veteran appearance that matched its pilot perfectly. She descended into the canyon with her weapons systems hot, the targeting computer cycling through threat assessments faster than human thought. The walls rose around her like the throat of some ancient god, stone the color of old blood in the setting sun. Her radio erupted with panicked voices, ground forces calling coordinates, enemy fire converging from 3 directions, someone screaming for medevac. Beneath it all, a calmer voice, the unit commander probably trying to maintain order while his world collapsed around him. All stations, this is Ripper 6. Consolidate on my position. We're going to make our stand here. Vesper recognized the tone. She'd heard it before, in 100 different voices, always meaning the same thing. We're not getting out of this. She checked her ammunition counter. 1,100 rounds of 30mm, 4 AGM-65 Mavericks, 2 rocket pods. Enough to make a difference if she was smart and lucky and willing to fly closer to the walls than her training had ever permitted. She rolled inverted for 3 seconds to get a better look at the canyon floor, saw muzzle flashes sparking from cave entrances carved into both walls, saw the tight defensive circle of coalition forces dug in around a dried riverbed. They were boxed in perfectly, caught in a kill zone designed by someone who understood terrain and ambush tactics. Ripper 6, Vesper 2-1. I'm rolling in from your north. Keep your heads down and mark your friendlies. There was a pause then. Vesper 2-1 negative. Command has called off the strike. You're ordered to RTB. She didn't acknowledge the order. Instead, she lit her afterburners. A waste of fuel on an aircraft not designed for speed, but she needed every knot, and came around the canyon's northern rim at an angle that put her wingtip 20 feet from solid rock. The A-10 wasn't meant for this kind of flying. It was a ground attack platform, slow and steady, designed to loiter over battlefields and provide sustained fire support. But Vesper had learned years ago that doctrine was written by people who'd never had to choose between breaking rules and watching good soldiers die. She armed her cannon and began her run, the targeting reticle settling on the first cave entrance with mathematical precision. The sound of the GAU-8 Avenger firing is like nothing else in modern warfare, a deep, ripping growl that registers in your bones before your ears, a sound that speaks to something primal about predators and prey. The first burst walked 30mm depleted uranium rounds across the cave mouth, each round hitting with the force of a small car traveling at supersonic speed. Rock exploded outward in chunks the size of basketballs. Whatever had been firing from that position ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. She pulled up hard, her airframe groaning, and swung wide for the second pass. Enemy fire reached up toward her, tracer rounds like deadly fireflies, the distinct corkscrew smoke trail of a shoulder-fired missile. She dumped chaff and flares, rolled right, and came back around so tight her vision grayed at the edges. Below, the ground forces had figured out what she was doing and were pressing their advantage, moving forward under her cover. Ripper 6's voice came through her headset, different now, edged with something that might have been awe. Vesper, you just cleared our entire western approach. We're pushing through. She didn't waste breath responding. The eastern wall still held enemy positions, and her fuel gauge was already dropping faster than she liked. The second pass was lower, closer, her landing gear almost brushing the canyon's southern rim as she lined up on a cluster of technical vehicles, pickup trucks mounted with heavy weapons, the kind of improvised armor that had become the signature of every insurgent force from Mosul to Mogadishu. She toggled to her Mavericks, let the infrared seeker head lock onto the largest heat signature, and squeezed the trigger. The missile dropped away from her wing with a clunk she felt through the airframe, then accelerated downward on a plume of white smoke. 3 seconds later, the night erupted in orange flame as the vehicle's fuel tank cooked off, setting off a chain reaction that consumed 2 more trucks. She was already lining up her next target when the radio crackled with a new voice, older, authoritative, pissed off. Vesper 2-1, this is actual. You are ordered to break off and return to base immediately. Acknowledge. She keyed her mic. Actual, I'm a little busy right now. We'll call you back. Then she switched frequencies before anyone could respond. It was the kind of insubordination that ended careers, and Vesper knew it even as she rolled into her third attack run. But she'd made this calculation before, back when she'd been a captain and a congressman's son had died, because someone higher up the chain had been more worried about international incidents than American lives. She'd filed the after-action report that burned her first shot at a promotion, had stood in front of a review board and explained in precise detail why the rules had been wrong and the dead were still dead. They'd assigned her to a training squadron after that, flying circles over Nevada while younger pilots got the combat deployments she'd earned. She'd spent 2 years in that purgatory before someone with actual combat experience looked at her record and decided the Air Force couldn't afford to waste someone who understood what war actually cost. Now here she was, doing it again, breaking the rules because the rules were written by people who didn't have to watch soldiers die from a safe distance. The canyon walls blurred past her canopy as she dropped to minimum altitude, her threat warning system screaming about radar locks and missile launches. She ignored it all, focused on the task with the kind of concentration that made everything else, fear, doubt, the future, fall away into insignificance. This was what she'd trained for, not the ribbon cuttings and award ceremonies, but this, metal and flesh and split-second decisions where hesitation meant watching men die. She pickled off her remaining mavericks in quick succession, watched them arc downward into enemy positions with almost lazy grace, then pulled up into a climbing turn that put every G-force rating to the test. Behind her, the canyon floor was a rolling landscape of fire and smoke. Enemy fire had slackened noticeably. Below, coalition forces were advancing, using the chaos to break the kill zone and establish better positions. It was working. Against every assessment, every computer model, every general's resigned prediction, it was actually working. But her fuel gauge was reading critical, and she'd burned through most of her ammunition. The smart play was to climb out, head for the tanker that was probably already vectoring toward her position, refuel and rearm. The smart play was to let someone else finish what she'd started. Vesper had never been very good at making smart plays. She radioed down to Ripper 6 directly, bypassing the command net. "Ripper, Vesper, what's your status?" The response came back between bursts of gunfire. "Vesper, we've got movement, but we're still taking heavy fire from the northern caves. We need another pass on those positions or we're going to get pinned again." She checked her ammunition counter. 300 rounds left, maybe 400 if she'd counted wrong. Not much, but enough. "Copy that, Ripper. I'm Winchester on missiles, but I can make one more gun run. Mark your position with IR strobes and stay low." She didn't mention that one more gun run meant she wouldn't have enough fuel to make it back to base, or that flying this low in a canyon with near-zero visibility and enemy fire converging from multiple vectors was roughly equivalent to playing Russian roulette with every chamber loaded. Some things didn't need to be said. She armed her cannon for the final time and nosed down into the darkness, her targeting computer struggling to differentiate between rock face and enemy positions. The night vision overlay turned everything into shades of green and gray, a surreal landscape where death hid in shadows and every outcropping might conceal an RPG team. She exhaled slowly, steadying her breathing, and began her last run. The A-10's cannon spoke again, that deep earth-shaking roar that made strong men flinch and sent small animals running for miles. She walked her fire across the northern cave complex, depleting her ammunition reserves with each trigger pull, turning ancient stone into lethal shrapnel. The recoil was so powerful it slowed her forward momentum noticeably, physics made visible, every action demanding its equal and opposite reaction. Tracer fire reached up toward her from positions she hadn't identified yet, green and red lines of light that crossed her flight path with mathematical precision. One round punched through her left aileron with a sound like someone hitting a tin roof with a hammer. Another sparked off her engine cowling, deflected by the titanium bathtub that protected the A-10's cockpit and vital systems. She felt the hit rather than heard it, a shudder that ran through the airframe like a living thing flinching from pain. Her warning systems lit up, hydraulic pressure dropping in the left system, fuel leak detected in the number 2 tank, fire warning on the starboard engine. She shut down the compromised engine with practiced efficiency, her hands moving through the emergency procedures while her eyes stayed locked on the targeting reticle. Still had rounds left, still had altitude, still had a job to finish. The last of her ammunition hammered out in a final sustained burst that turned a cave entrance into a crater. Then the gun clicked empty, and the canyon fell into relative silence. Below, the ground forces were moving again, exploiting the opening she'd created, spreading out from their defensive position toward better terrain. On her radio, someone was cheering, actual honest-to-God cheering, a sound she hadn't heard since that mission over Kandahar that had ended with her dragging a damaged aircraft back to base on one engine and pure stubbornness. She pulled up and away from the canyon floor, climbing into the clear air above the killing ground, her damaged aircraft responding to the controls with sluggish reluctance. The fire warning on her starboard engine was persistent now, the kind of alarm that suggested she had minutes rather than hours to find a place to put down. She ran the numbers in her head, distance to base, fuel remaining, airspeed accounting for the damage, and came up with an answer she didn't like. She keyed her radio, using the command frequency this time. Actual, Vesper 2-1. I'm RTB with battle damage, single engine. I need emergency vectors and a crash crew standing by. The response was immediate, all business now that her insubordination had achieved results. Vesper 2-1, copy. Nearest emergency strip is 40 miles northeast. Squawk emergency and we'll vector you in. She adjusted her heading, nursing her remaining engine, watching the fuel gauge drop with steady inevitability. The A-10 could fly a long way on one engine, but not forever, and not with fuel leaking from a compromised tank. Behind her, the canyon was receding into the darkness, just another piece of unnamed geography where nameless men had fought and died for reasons that would be argued about by historians who'd never held a rifle. In her headset, Ripper 6's voice broke through the command chatter. Vesper 2-1, this is Ripper 6. I don't know who you are or what you just did, but you saved 300 lives tonight. We owe you one. She felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Buy me a beer sometime, Ripper. Vesper out. Then she focused on the simple problem of keeping her aircraft airborne for 40 more miles, one engine purring, the other one dark and cooling, the night sky opening up around her like a black ocean. The emergency strip materialized out of the darkness 28 minutes later, a ribbon of concrete carved into the desert, lit by portable lights that painted harsh shadows across the sand. She brought the A-10 down in a long, flat approach, fighting crosswinds with her damaged controls, and greased it onto the runway with a touchdown so gentle she almost didn't believe she'd made it. The aircraft rolled to a stop 3/4 of the way down the runway, trailing smoke from the dead engine, hydraulic fluid dripping onto the concrete in dark puddles. She went through the shutdown procedure with mechanical precision, flipping switches and closing valves until the cockpit fell silent except for the ticking of cooling metal. Then she sat there for a moment, hands still on the controls, breathing in the smell of burnt hydraulic fluid and her own fear sweat, and allowed herself to acknowledge that she'd just done something monumentally stupid and incredibly necessary. The crew chiefs who swarmed her aircraft moments later took one look at the damage and started swearing. One of them, a staff sergeant with 20 years of experience written into the creases around his eyes, climbed up to her cockpit and stared at the bullet holes stitched across her fuselage. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "how the hell are you still alive?" She unfastened her harness and climbed down, legs shaky now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Skill, Sergeant, and a really good aircraft," he snorted. "That's one word for it." They drove her back to the main base in a Humvee that rattled over every pothole, giving her 40 minutes to prepare for the conversation she knew was coming. Colonel Marcus Thorne was waiting in his office, a thin man with iron-gray hair and the kind of expression that suggested he'd been rehearsing his speech for the last hour. She stood at attention in front of his desk, still in her flight suit, and waited for the hammer to fall. He let the silence stretch, a classic intimidation tactic, then finally spoke. "Major Kine, you want to tell me what the hell you were thinking out there?" She met his eyes steadily. "I was thinking about 300 soldiers who needed close air support, sir. You were ordered to stand down by me personally." "Yes, sir." "And you ignored that order." "Yes, sir." He stood up, walked around his desk, and stopped a foot away from her. "Do you understand that what you did constitutes insubordination, that I could have you court-martialed?" "I understand, sir." Another pause, longer this time. Then unexpectedly he smiled, just a slight quirk of the lips there and gone. "You're aware that Ripper 6's unit was supposed to be a total loss. The intelligence assessments gave them a 15% chance of survival even with air support." She didn't respond. "The CIA had spotters in the area. They recorded your entire run. Every pass. The analysis team says what you did in that canyon violated at least 6 different safety protocols and probably rewrote the tactical manual for close air support in confined terrain." He walked back around his desk and dropped into his chair, suddenly looking tired. You're getting the Distinguished Flying Cross for this kind, along with a formal reprimand for disobeying direct orders. The reprimand will stay in your jacket but won't be career-ending, assuming you don't make a habit of ignoring commands. The medal will get you promoted and probably land you an instructor position at Nellie's. Questions? She allowed herself a small smile. Just one, sir. When do I get my aircraft back? He actually laughed at that. When the crew chiefs figure out how to replace an entire engine and half the hydraulic system. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Until then, you're on administrative stand-down. Get some rest, Kine, you've earned it. She saluted, turned to leave, and was almost at the door when he called out again. Vesper. She turned back. Sir. That call sign of yours, I looked up how you got it, the Evening Star thing. He paused. It fits. Don't lose it chasing brass and politics. The Air Force needs pilots who remember why we're out here. She nodded once, then slipped out into the corridor before the moment could get any more sentimental. The next morning, she was woken by a knock on her quarters door at 0600. She answered it in PT gear to find a captain she didn't recognize holding a satellite phone. Major Kine, you have a call. It's from the White House. She took the phone with a sense of unreality, pressed it to her ear. This is Major Kine. The voice on the other end was familiar from 100 news broadcasts, calm and measured, even discussing impossible things. Major, I wanted to personally thank you for your actions 2 nights ago. The men you saved, some of them have families, kids, futures they wouldn't have without your courage. She didn't know what to say to that, so she settled for, I was just doing my job, Mr. President. No, the voice replied. You did something much rarer than that. You saw what needed to be done and you did it, consequences be damned. That's not duty, Major. That's heroism, the real kind, without cameras or speeches. The call ended a few moments later with promises of a formal ceremony and medals she didn't want. She handed the phone back to the captain, who looked at her like she'd just grown a second head, and went back inside to process what her life had become in the span of 48 hours. The ceremony happened 3 weeks later at Langley, with enough brass in attendance to start a decent-sized war. They pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross on her dress uniform while photographers clicked away, and a general whose name she immediately forgot read a citation that made her sound like some kind of airborne superhero. She stood at attention through it all, focusing on a spot on the far wall, and thought about the A-10 mechanics who'd spent 18-hour days rebuilding her aircraft. They were the real heroes as far as she was concerned, the ones who kept ancient airframes flying through sheer expertise and stubbornness. The general finished his speech and stepped aside, and then Ripper 6 was walking across the stage in his own dress uniform, looking uncomfortable in anything that wasn't multicam. He stopped in front of her, rendered a salute that was probably the best one he'd managed in years, and said, Ma'am, that beer I promised. Next time you're stateside. She returned the salute. I'll hold you to that, Ripper. The applause that followed was genuine, the kind that came from people who understood what had actually happened in that canyon, stripped of politics and rhetoric and all the theater that usually surrounded military valor. She flew her repaired A-10 back to active duty a week later, after the crew chiefs had run every test twice and signed off on airworthiness with the kind of reluctant approval that suggested they still didn't quite believe the aircraft had survived. The bullet holes were patched, the hydraulics replaced, the engine overhauled. But there was something different now, something the ground crews whispered about when they thought she wasn't listening. Her aircraft had developed a reputation, passed through the informal networks that connected crew chiefs and maintainers across every base in the theater. They called it the Canyon Ghost, the A-10 that had carved through impossible terrain and come home on one engine. Pilots who'd laughed at her before suddenly wanted to fly on her wing, and the jokes about her gender and her height dried up completely. She'd proven something that night in the canyon, not to them but to herself, that she belonged in that cockpit, that her instincts were sound, that when the moment came to choose between safety and salvation, she'd make the right call. The call sign Vesper took on deeper meaning now, not just the evening star, but the light that burned brightest when everything else had gone dark. 6 months later, she was leading a 4-ship formation over northern Syria when the call came in. Another unit pinned down, another canyon, smaller this time but no less deadly. The tactical situation was different but the mathematics were the same. Good soldiers dying because they'd walked into a trap designed by someone who understood terrain better than the intelligence analysts who'd cleared the mission. Her flight lead queried command for permission to engage. The response was immediate, negative. The political situation was too delicate, the risk of civilian casualties too high. The whole mission existed in a gray area of international law that made generals nervous. She listened to the radio chatter, heard the ground force commander trying to coordinate a fighting withdrawal, heard the fear in voices that were trying hard to stay professional. Then she made her decision. Flight, this is Vesper 2-1. I'm breaking formation and rolling in. Anyone who wants to join me is welcome, but I'm going in either way. There was a pause, then her wingman's voice came through, a young lieutenant named McKenna who'd grown up idolizing the pilots from Desert Storm. Lead McKenna, I'm with you. One by one, the others chimed in. They followed her down into the canyon in a staggered attack formation, their A-10s dropping through the thermal layers like stones through water, and wrote another chapter in a story that was becoming legend. The after-action report tried to make it sound routine, tried to reduce the mission to grid coordinates and ammunition expenditures and time-on-target statistics. But the ground force commander wrote his own report, one that found its way onto secure servers and eventually to congressional committees, describing how 4 aircraft had appeared overhead when command had written them off, how a pilot with the call sign Vesper had coordinated a close air support pattern so precise that insurgent positions were eliminated without a single civilian casualty. The report noted that the same pilot had previously been reprimanded for similar actions, and it asked pointed questions about a command structure that seemed more interested in covering its ass than protecting soldiers on the ground. Those questions made uncomfortable reading for people who'd spent their careers learning how to survive in bureaucracy, and Vesper found herself called into offices where colonels and generals tried to figure out whether she was a hero or a problem. The answer, she suspected, was both. She'd never been good at staying inside lines that someone else had drawn, had always possessed an inconvenient tendency to prioritize lives over regulations. It made her dangerous to the people who valued order above outcomes, who believed that following procedure was more important than achieving results. They promoted her to lieutenant colonel and gave her a squadron of her own, 18 aircraft and 70 personnel at a forward operating base, so remote it didn't appear on commercial maps. It was a posting that could have been a reward or a punishment, depending on how you looked at it. Command authority but no political oversight. Freedom to operate but zero margin for error. She turned it into something remarkable. Her squadron became known for precision strikes and zero collateral damage, for missions that other units declined, for a commander who led from the front and never asked anyone to fly a mission she wouldn't fly herself. Pilots requested transfers to serve under her. Enlisted personnel worked overtime without complaint because they knew their efforts mattered, that their commander would use every tool they gave her to bring soldiers home alive. The squadron's unofficial motto, painted on the ready room wall by some crew chief with a sense of history, was simple: when others turn back. It wasn't authorized by any regulation, would probably violate a dozen protocols about unit insignia, but no one had the heart to paint over it because everyone knew it was true. This was where you came when the mission was impossible, when the brass had given up, when someone needed to do something that existed outside the normal boundaries of acceptable risk. The legend grew despite, or perhaps because of, her reluctance to embrace it. She didn't give interviews, didn't write memoirs, didn't do the speaking circuit that awaited most decorated pilots. She flew her missions, maintained her aircraft, and trained the next generation of pilots to think tactically and act decisively when the moment demanded it. But stories filtered out anyway, carried by ground forces who'd called her in when everything else had failed, by crew chiefs who'd watched her bring home aircraft that shouldn't have been able to fly, by the pilots who'd followed her into situations that defied both common sense and military doctrine. They talked about the time she'd flown through a sandstorm to extract a reconnaissance team, about the night mission over Yemen, where she'd coordinated 3 different airframes to take out a convoy without waking the village 200 meters away, about the training exercise where she demonstrated that A-10s could perform close air support at altitudes and angles everyone had said were impossible. The stories took on embellishments, as stories do. Speeds got faster, canyons got narrower, odds got longer, but the core remained true. Somewhere in the gray area between regulation and necessity, a pilot with the call sign Vesper had figured out how to make the impossible look routine. Years passed. The wars continued their slow, grinding evolution, morphing from conventional conflicts into the kind of asymmetric warfare, where victory was measured in reduced violence rather than captured territory. Vesper accumulated flight hours and combat missions, turned down desk jobs that would have advanced her career, kept flying because flying was the only thing that made sense to her. She was 42 when the call came through about the Afghan evacuation, the desperate scramble to extract personnel as government forces collapsed faster than anyone had predicted. They needed experienced pilots who could operate in hot zones, who could make snap decisions with incomplete information, who wouldn't freeze when everything went sideways. Her name was at the top of every list. She took a squadron into Kabul 3 days before the final withdrawal, landed at an airport under sporadic fire, and spent 72 hours running evacuation flights while the security situation deteriorated around her. Other pilots described it later as the most intense sustained operations of their careers. Vesper called it Tuesday. When it was over, when the last aircraft had lifted off with the last evacuees, and the airport fell to Taliban forces minutes later, she'd flown 41 sorties in 3 days on maybe 10 hours of total sleep. The Air Force gave her another medal. She put it in a drawer with the others and went back to work. The end came quietly, without drama or ceremony. She was 51, a full colonel now, commanding a training wing at Nellie's where young pilots learned the principles she'd spent 30 years refining. She'd been planning to retire the following year, had already started thinking about what came after, maybe consulting work, maybe teaching at a civilian flight school, maybe just silence and a small house somewhere without artillery fire on the horizon. Then during a routine physical, the flight surgeon found something on the scan. Stage 3, they told her. Aggressive, treatable but not curable. She had maybe 2 years, probably less, and most of that time would be consumed by treatments that would leave her too weak to fly. She listened to the diagnosis with the same calm she brought to emergency situations, asked practical questions about timelines and procedures, and didn't cry until she was alone in her quarters that night. The grief wasn't for herself. She'd made peace with mortality the first time she'd been shot at. But for all the flights she wouldn't take, all the pilots she wouldn't train, all the moments she'd miss watching the sun rise from 30,000 feet where the air was thin and clean, and the earth curved away beneath her wings. She retired with full honors 6 months later, after the treatments had stolen her flight certification, but before they could steal anything else. They held the ceremony at Nellie's with every pilot she'd ever trained in attendance, a sea of flight suits and ribbons that represented 30 years of missions and memories. The commandant spoke about leadership and courage, and the kind of legacy that transcended individual achievement. Vesper stood at attention in dress blues that hung looser than they should have, listened to words that tried to capture something too large for language, and thought about the moment she'd first understood what it meant to fly. She'd been 7 years old, watching contrails scratch white lines across a blue sky, and she'd known with absolute certainty that she belonged up there. Everything after, the academy, flight school, combat deployments, medals, near-death experiences, had been footnotes to that single moment of recognition. She'd spent her life chasing that feeling, that perfect synthesis of machine and skill and purpose that happened when you pushed an aircraft to its limits, and found something transcendent on the other side. They could take her flight status, could ground her permanently, but they couldn't take the memory of all those flights, all those moments when she'd been exactly where she needed to be. The disease progressed faster than the doctors predicted, as diseases often do when the patient has been pushing their body beyond reasonable limits for 3 decades. Vesper spent her final months quietly, in a rental house outside Las Vegas where the desert stretched away to mountains that turned purple at sunset. She had visitors, old squadron mates, ground forces she'd supported, pilots she'd trained who'd gone on to their own distinguished careers. They came to pay respects and found instead that she wanted to hear their stories, wanted to know about their lives and families, and the things they'd done since leaving her command. She was building something in those conversations, constructing a map of all the places her influence had spread, all the decisions she'd made that had rippled outward through other lives. It was a kind of legacy she'd never intended, but couldn't help acknowledging now that time was running short. Every pilot she'd trained had trained others. Every mission she'd flown had established precedents that changed how future missions were planned. The insubordination she'd committed in that unnamed canyon had become doctrine, taught at staff colleges as an example of when and how to exercise initiative outside formal authority. She'd changed things without meaning to, just by showing up and doing the work. The call came from Ripper 6 on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, when the desert air was finally cool enough to sit outside without melting. His real name was Thomas Rivera, and he was a retired colonel now himself, running a nonprofit that provided support services to veterans. They'd stayed in touch over the years, trading emails and occasional phone calls, maintaining the connection that formed between people who'd seen each other in extremis. Now his voice came through her phone steady and warm. "Vesper, heard you're not doing so great," she smiled despite everything. "That's one way to put it. How's the nonprofit?" "Growing. We just opened a second location in Virginia, which is actually why I'm calling." He paused. "We want to name the building after you, the Vesper Kind Center for Veteran Services. I know you hate this kind of attention, but I figured you might make an exception." She looked out at the desert, at the mountains turning gold in the afternoon light. "Tom, I appreciate it. But use my real name if you're going to do it. Vesper is what I did. My name is who I am." Another pause then. "Copy that. The Margox Kind Center it is." They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing important, just two old soldiers sharing space across a phone line, and when they hung up she felt something settle inside her chest. This was how it ended. Not with grand gestures, but with small acknowledgments, with buildings named and stories told, with the knowledge that she'd mattered to people whose lives she'd touched. She died on a December morning with snow falling outside her window, a meteorological impossibility in the Nevada desert that felt like a final gift from a universe with a sense of dramatic timing. Her last clear thought was about flying, about the moment you pushed the throttle forward and felt the aircraft come alive beneath you, about the perfect stillness at the top of a loop when gravity released its hold and you hung suspended between earth and sky. Then the thought faded into something deeper and less distinct, a sensation rather than a concept, and she slipped away so quietly the hospice nurse almost didn't notice. The funeral was held at Arlington with full military honors. They buried her on a hillside that overlooked the Pentagon, within sight of the building where her career had nearly ended before it could properly begin. The service was attended by 300 people, including 2 generals, the commandant of the Air Force Academy, and a delegation of ground forces led by Tom Rivera, who'd survived that canyon because a pilot they'd never met had decided rules mattered less than lives. The A-10 flyover at the end of the ceremony was unscheduled and technically unauthorized. 4 aircraft in missing man formation that broke overhead and climbed into winter sky, while everyone below stood silent with hands over hearts. The story should have ended there, with the funeral and the medals and the building named in her honor. But stories about people like Margox Kind don't really end. They transform into something larger, becoming myths that new generations inherit and reinterpret. Flight instructors at Nellie's told her story to students learning close air support, using her canyon run as a teaching case about initiative and calculated risk. Ground Force commanders referenced her decisions in staff meetings when debating rules of engagement. The A-10 community, that tight fraternity of pilots who flew the ugly beloved aircraft nobody else wanted, painted her call sign on ready room walls and told stories about the pilot who'd understood better than anyone what the aircraft could do when pushed beyond its nominal limits. She became a touchstone, a reference point, a standard against which other pilots measured their own courage and commitment. Young women entering the Air Force heard her name and saw possibility where previous generations had seen barriers. The official histories mentioned her medals and her combat record. The unofficial histories, the ones that mattered more, talked about her character and her choices, and the way she'd lived as though the only thing that mattered was showing up when people needed help. 10 years after her death, the Air Force commissioned a study on tactical innovation in close air support, looking at how doctrine had evolved in response to changing battlefield conditions. Her name appeared 73 times in the report, cited as originator or primary influence on tactics that had become standard practice. The Canyon mission was analyzed in detail, broken down into phases and decision points, transformed from a moment of insubordination into a teaching case about adaptive leadership under pressure. The report concluded that her career represented a masterclass in balancing institutional authority with situational necessity, in knowing when rules served their purpose and when they became obstacles to mission accomplishment. It was dry academic language trying to capture something that couldn't be reduced to doctrine: the human quality of judgment, the ability to see clearly when others were blinded by fear or procedure, the courage to act when action carried consequences. But between the bureaucratic sentences, if you knew how to read them, the report acknowledged what everyone who'd served with her already knew. She'd been extraordinary not because she broke rules, but because she understood which rules existed to be broken, and which ones were load-bearing walls you removed at your peril. 20 years later, a filmmaker stumbled across her story while researching women in combat aviation. The resulting documentary spent more time on her squadron mates and the ground forces she'd supported than on Margox herself, letting others build the portrait through their memories and testimonies. They talked about her tactical brilliance and her willingness to mentor junior pilots, about the time she'd grounded herself rather than fly, a mission she didn't think was properly planned, about her insistence that every person in her chain of command mattered regardless of rank or specialty. Tom Rivera appeared extensively, older now but still carrying himself with military bearing, describing that night in the canyon from the perspective of someone who'd been certain he was about to die. "We heard her call sign on the radio," he said, staring into the camera with eyes that had seen too much. "And I swear to God, half my team started crying. Because we knew. We knew she'd come for us even if it killed her, because that's who she was." The documentary won awards and played in theaters, and did what documentary films rarely accomplish. It told a true story that felt true, that captured something essential about courage and sacrifice without sentimentality or melodrama. But perhaps the most fitting memorial came from an unexpected source: the enemy fighters who'd been in that canyon when she'd made her run. They'd survived, some of them, had scattered into the mountains and eventually found their way to peace negotiations and reconciliation programs. One of them, interviewed years later under condition of anonymity, described the attack from the receiving end. "We thought we had them trapped," he said through a translator. "The canyon was perfect. They couldn't escape, their air support couldn't reach them, we just had to wait. Then that plane came. I don't know how to describe it, the sound, the way it moved through the canyon like it was threading a needle, the precision of the strikes. We're trained fighters, we don't scare easily, but that was like fighting a demon. We broke and ran because staying meant dying, simple as that." It was a strange kind of compliment, respect from someone who'd been trying to kill the men she saved. But it confirmed what the footage and the reports had suggested. She'd achieved something close to perfection that night, had pushed herself and her aircraft to the absolute limit and found just enough capability to make the difference. The sky doesn't remember the aircraft that passed through it. The air closes behind them, leaving no trace, no permanent record of their presence. But people remember, and in remembering they keep stories alive long past the deaths of their protagonists. Margot's kind flew her last mission 2 decades ago, was buried with honors and remembered in official histories. But somewhere tonight, in a ready room at Nellie's or Langley or Aviano, a young pilot is hearing the story for the first time, about the canyon and the call sign, and the pilot who understood that rules existed to serve people, not the other way around. They'll listen with the mixture of skepticism and wonder that greets all legendary tales, will ask questions about the specifics and the outcomes. And then they'll go fly their own missions, carrying with them some fragment of that story, some piece of the example she set. They'll make their own decisions about when to follow orders and when to exercise judgment, and some of them will choose correctly because they remember a pilot named Vesper who showed them it was possible. That's the real legacy, not the medals or the buildings or the documentary films. It's the subtle influence that ripples through time, changing how people think about courage and duty, and the space between what you're ordered to do and what you know is right. It's the evening star still visible after sunset, still guiding people home through the gathering dark.